Well, good afternoon. It's good to be with all of you once again on this Lord's Day. The text before the lesson is Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. Genesis 2, verse 15. These are God's words. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work and to keep it. May God bless the reading and preaching of His Word. Amen. Please be seated. Thank you for standing. A number of years ago, I spoke at the funeral of a popular high school football coach named Bob Lewis. And Bob asked me to speak on a subject which was near and dear to his heart, and that is manhood. What does it mean to act like men, as the Apostle Paul commands in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13? Now, to be honest, I was a little surprised. I was, in fact, more than a little surprised that Bob wanted me, of all people, to offer insight on this topic, especially given the numerous glowing examples of virility among his many associates. Indeed, a constant source of amusement between us was to compare his gridiron ruggedness with my prep school fragility. But as I thought more deeply on the subject, I realized that what made Bob a real man was not just his ruggedness, but his readiness to make the lives of those around him better. His willingness to sacrifice his own interests for the sake of his community, as a father, as a coach, as a veteran. According to the opening chapters of Genesis, real men have essentially two characteristics. They are gardeners and they are guardians. And these defining tasks are revealed by God immediately following the creation of Adam. Again, verse 15 of chapter 2 of Genesis says, the Lord God took the man and He placed him in the Garden of Eden. And He did so that He might work it and keep it. So Moses, the narrator of this passage, provides us with a pithy summary of man's responsibilities to work and to keep. And in the agricultural context, the Hebrew word translated work refers, of course, to cultivation. Placed in the garden, Adam was to make things grow in healthy and harmonious ways, to bring the same order to the garden that God had to the universe. To be a loving nurturer who sacrificially tended God's good creation, cherishing it and bringing it to its full potential. And in this endeavor, man's wife was to be his helper, his co-laborer, as together they built a household from which they would fulfill the cultural mandate. A household that Adam was to protect from every enemy, foreign and domestic, we might say. This is an understanding of masculinity that is radically different, of course, than that of our prevailing culture. I mean, for one thing, the notion of man as primary nurturer has been utterly lost in the modern West. When we think of the task of child rearing, for example, we think of it being the domain of women, and that a man's responsibility is to leave home, earn a wage, and then return to find his household properly managed by his wife. Which is the way it should be, we think, for men are too crude and tough to be nurturing. A cultural belief which has reduced man's role essentially to guardianship. Although in late modernity, even this responsibility is shifting to women. Recently, the Georgetown Police Department joined a nationwide movement called the 30 by 30 Pledge, which is a commitment to make 30% of the police force female by 2030. This week I watched dash cam footage of a female officer being wrestled to the ground by what we would have to describe as a senior citizen during a traffic stop. The only thing that saved the woman's life were a couple of male bystanders who jumped in to rescue her. After another deputy handcuffed the man, the woman officer started berating the assailant, shouting at him, "What's wrong with you? Don't you know that you're not supposed to treat women like that?" The police force is essentially an extension, we might even say an amplification, of male household guardianship. This is something that we have forgotten, or at least we're pretending like we have forgotten it. This woman apparently is wanting, on the one hand, to play the role of guardian, but on the other, to maintain the reality of male guardianship the moment that she gets in trouble. And so we have a grown woman essentially still playing dress up. One of the things, by the way, that the sort of foregrounding of transgenderism has done, the putting it front and center and making it, acceptable in society, is that it makes it obvious to everyone that when a man pretends to be a woman, it is a hideous sight. Well, the same is true we're learning when it comes, it's surprising we have to learn these things, but when it comes to women acting like men. The least attractive thing that a woman can do to a man whose desires are rightly ordered is to act like a man. Now, having been left with less and less to do, modern man is facing an identity crisis, and for good reason. Because men were created to be guardians, to protect the vulnerable, most principally the weaker sex, and to be gardeners, to bring forth a bountiful harvest in the Lord's vineyard, to cultivate the spiritual and physical development of their households and communities. Therefore, fathers are to play the principal role in the rearing of their children. A father's job is to plant, fertilize, water, and harvest the growth of character, godliness, competence, and joy in his offspring. Men are also to tend to their wives, to cherish them, to plant them in the rich soil of the Word so that they may flourish and be presented to our Lord in all of their splendor upon his return, as Paul puts it in Ephesians 5. Is that someone's ringtone? That would be a crazy ringtone. Men, in other words, are the Lord's husbandmen. The word husband has the sense of manager or steward of the household. But in its original sense, it meant the tiller of soil. A laborer who follows, by the way, in the footsteps of Jesus, who is the ultimate gardener and guardian, who not only protects us from desolation, sustaining the universe in its existence, but who sends his Spirit to produce a harvest of righteousness in this world, empowering the work of new creation, a recultivation of this neglected planet. Listen to our Lord as he laments over those who have refused his nurturing care in Matthew 23:37. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." Such tenderness makes modern men uncomfortable. For we tend to think that toughness and tenderness are mutually exclusive traits, that Jesus wasn't both a lion and a lamb. But consider the nurturing actions of the Apostle Paul, who, by the way, certainly could bring the rod of correction. But consider these nurturing actions in his laboring among the brethren of Thessalonica, which was read to us a a moment ago. I'll read 2 verses from it in 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 7 and 8. He says, "But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children, so being affectionately desirous of you," the King James there is quoted, "we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us." And this nurturing of man extends to the planet itself. As men collectively and generationally have cultivated this world, refining it into a proper dwelling place, a piece of heaven on earth. Men are innovators by nature. They are risk takers. They are pioneers who have colonized the planet. All of the great, let's just go through the list, all the great classical composers have been men. All of the Nobel Prize winners have been men. All of the great epic poets have been men. All of the great dramatists have been men. All of the elite mathematicians have been men. All of the great generals have been men, and farmers, and on we can go. Western civilization has been built on the backs of men, both in terms of the ideas and also certainly in terms of the implementation. You may find that offensive, but you need to listen to some of the older feminists, because they are now beginning to realize this and say it quite boldly. They refer to themselves as dissident feminists, which I'm okay with. But Camille Paglia, a famous feminist, now says things like this: if civilization had been left in female hands, we would still be living in grass huts beating on drums. Men are designed to be gardeners and nurturers, a vocation which the devil has been quite successful in persuading modern men to abandon. Which makes sense, of course, for Satan's only hope is to delay the cultivation of this world as long as possible, prolonging the return of Christ and his own demise. But in late modernity, we are also losing our role as guardians, as we said, having given our strength to conniving women, not only our physical strength, but our mental, spiritual, and emotional strength. We have believed the lie that the masculine virtues of courage and toughness and power and magnanimity are toxic. And as a result, most men are now too weak to protect anyone, too weak to be dangerous. And there is great need for men to be dangerous. Indeed, all of civilization depends upon us being dangerous. Not evil, but also not safe, rather good, as C.S. Lewis often describes God. It seems to me, and this is not a profound insight, but it seems to me that the popularity of Donald Trump or people like Andrew Tate and these others, these sort of really very domineering male figures, is because we are, especially among conservative Christians, is because we are so desperate for men to exercise strength. We are desperate for it. And so apparently we will receive it in whatever form it comes. With the rest of our time, I want to further undermine this modern and postmodern reductionistic view of men by giving a brief history of its emergence, a genealogy of sorts which relies heavily upon the work of numerous scholars, historians, not the least of which is Nancy Pearcey, who you've heard me perhaps talk about before. She wrote a book called The Toxic War on Masculinity. In our men's class, we studied it last week, and we thought to ourselves last year, in fact, we read 3 books on this subject in the men's group. And as we read through those, we thought to ourselves that I need to put together a sermon to summarize what we've learned, because there was so much important information. One of the books that we read was The Toxic War on Masculinity. But I'm giving this lesson now. I should have given it earlier, but it's apropos that I give it now, because it will help prepare us for the book study that both the men and women are going to engage in. It provides the background, you might say, or the context to C.R. Wiley's book, Man of the House. This book that we're going to read and have already read a portion of speaks to what we should do in this present cultural moment. What do we do now? But in order for those solutions to make sense, we need to understand the times that we are living in, which we've talked about a lot in sermons, but also a little bit about the history as to how we got here. I was thinking about describing this as sort of a primer on this genealogy. But here's the thing, this is the male side of it. I'm going to tell the story from the male point of view, and next week the plan is to tell it from the female point of view. So next week we'll be looking at the toxic war on femininity. But both of these I'm hoping are going to provide some context for the study that we're going to be engaged in. So here goes. Throughout human history, and this will be quite brief, the majority of people have lived on either family farms or in peasant communities. Because of this, work was not a father's sole responsibility. Rather, it was a family enterprise, which meant that the foundational economic unit was the household, not the individual. A domestic economy that would include not only the father, mother, and their children, what we call the nuclear family, but extended beyond family members to apprentices, extended family members, slaves, hired hands, and others. And often the house itself would be divided into living quarters on one end and offices, workshops, or stores on the other. And this was true whether you lived in cities or in more rural areas. And what this meant for men, according to Piercy, is that being a father was not a separate activity that you came home to after clocking out at work. No, with a few exceptions like soldiers and sailors, fathers were a visible presence in the home, she writes. They introduced their children to the world of work, training them as they labored together. Sermons and child-rearing manuals during the colonial period in America, for example, were not addressed to mothers as they are today, but to fathers. And while we use the terminology of housewives, in the colonies it was common to call men house fathers. The word husband, as you likely read, C.R. Wiley's book, literally means bound to home. And according to historian John Gillis, this was true not only of artisans and farmers, but also business and professional men. They all conducted their work in the house, assisted by their wives and children. Indeed, men, says Gillis, were as comfortable in the kitchen as women, for they had responsibility for provisioning and managing the house. Cookbooks and domestic conduct books were directed primarily to them, and they were as devoted to decor as they were to hospitality. And we see something similar when we go back to the Reformation period. For Martin Luther once said that when a father washes diapers and performs some other mean task for his child, and someone ridicules him as an effeminate fool, he can be assured, for God with all his angels and creatures is smiling. That was Martin Luther who said that. Now, none of this undermined the father's authority in the home. But, as Piercy points out, and others have noted this, the colonists and those who came before them were operating under a very different concept of authority. Having been influenced by classical republicanism, they regarded social institutions like the household as organic structures ordered toward a common good. Meaning that the person in authority was the one that didn't pursue his own interests, but would pursue the interests of the community, which often meant setting aside his own well-being for the good of others. In the ancient world, this virtue was called pietas, and it's something that we've talked about a lot. The exemplar of it, of course, is Aeneas, who's the hero in Virgil's epic narrative, the Aeneid. For Aeneas, honor and glory was to be found not in the pursuit of his own selfish desires, not in his own comfort or his own personal flourishing, but in sublimating those desires for the good of his community. And so the great character arc of the Aeneid is the struggle of the hero to embrace this sense of duty, this sense of the preeminence of the common good. A life of sacrifice which Aeneas owed not only to his family and his community, but to his descendants and by extension the future people of Rome. According to the legend, the sacrifices of Aeneas led eventually to the establishment of the Roman Empire. This is their origin story. The lesson being that this is what piety produces, a true legacy. It produces a thriving civilization. A hero's journey which always resonated deeply in my spirit, even before I could account for it within my Christian worldview. Even before I realized, and it took me a long time, surprisingly, but that the character of Aeneas is just an antitype to the true and braver one that we read about in the Gospels. Jesus is the true and better Aeneas, we could say. The ultimate servant leader who sacrificed everything for the good of his household, the church. This is what true leadership is, the willingness to suffer the loss of fame, fortune, and even one's future for the sake of the common good. Another example could be George Washington. Talk about being politically incorrect. But think about Washington after serving 2 terms as president. He returns to the farm, right? I mean, at that point, people loved Washington so much they would have made him dictator. They didn't care. Whatever he wanted, they were going to give to him. But he served 2 terms, and then he retired to the farm. He was following the Roman general Cincinnatus, right, who was called from the farm because Rome had been invaded. He fought the battle against the enemy, destroyed them, and he let go of all that power, and he returned to a quiet life on his farm, demonstrating that what he did for his state was done not out of self-interest, but for the common good. It's interesting, King George, when the rumor was spreading that Washington was going to step down after 2 terms, King George even said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man on earth. To let go of that power. So in early America, a man was expected to find meaning and fulfillment, not so much in personal success, personal achievement, as through community success. We might say through institutional success, the family, the church, the state. Institutions everyone deeply invested in. The thinking was like this: if you invest in yourself, your return will be very limited. But if you invest in your community, you will be rich indeed. You will have a household that can go on for generations. And of course, in the Christian view, that can go on in a sense for eternity. So how did we lose touch with such virtuous masculinity? Well, according to Piercy and others, the shift began during the Industrial Revolution, which moved the location of industry from the home to the factory. And this forced fathers to leave their households and venture out to seek work, which, according to historian Pat Hudson, shattered the independent relationship between husband and wife, and really between father and household and community. It also made it difficult, says Piercy, for fathers to maintain anything like their traditional paternal role, for they no longer spent enough time with their children to educate them or enforce regular discipline or train them in adult skills and trades. And by the mid-19th century, child-rearing manuals no longer mentioned fathers. Sermons on the subject began to address women only. I mean, if you think about this, the traditional model, what it did is it created a natural environment in which a father could teach his children. right? As he taught them the family business. He could teach them everything that they needed to know about life by teaching them the craft that the family had learned and been passed down generation after generation. This created a very strong bond in the family. The household had a shared goal that their future absolutely depended upon. And they all gathered around, that bound them together. In an industrial economy, that's not the case. The father leaves. He's gone all day. He doesn't know what's going on with his children. He comes in and he's completely out of it. He's out of the picture. And so what he has to do is to create these sort of artificial versions of these goals, right? That's where you get things like sports start to emerge, things like the Boy Scouts. We're trying to create some sort of environment in which fathers and sons can interact so that a father can train his son and teach them. One of the places where you see, and it's just gotten completely out of hand, but one of the places you see this is if you go to a funeral, especially if you go to a funeral of someone who's sort of a captain of industry. And more often than not, their son's there, but they're estranged from their son. Their son doesn't really know his father, right? He was gone all the time working. But at his funeral, right, there'll be 10 men who will stand up and they'll weep. And talking about this man, how he was the greatest mentor they ever had. He taught them how to do business, that he was a father to them. Right? These are that man's sons there. The ones that he mentored in business, away from his home, as his son was estranged from him. I even think of this about my own son, because I have a very close relationship with my son, and I still function as a mentor to him spiritually and in many other ways. But my son has chosen accounting as his career, and so it's very likely, and already so, he's going to develop mentors, people who are going to teach him how to be a good accountant, how this business works, things that I don't know and I don't understand. And I pray that he will have good mentors in that. And I also pray that he'll listen to me, that he'll just move back here and we'll start a bunch of businesses and then we'll fix the problem. And according to Piercy, the new industrial world itself, over time, fostered a new definition of masculinity. In other words, we shaped our notion of masculinity to fit the culture. Here's one thing to take from this lesson and the one next week, is you have to be disabused of this idea that our present notion of masculinity or femininity is like, this is the way it's always been. Over and over again, people shape their view, even Christians. They will shape their interpretation of the Bible and masculinity to shape into the spirit of the age. And that's what happened when industrialization came in. We shaped the notion of masculinity to fit it. For the first time, men were spending all of their time with other men in competition. And survival in this new commercialized workplace required men to become more ambitious and self-assertive. A shift in focus from self-denial to self-assertion, which isn't just different, it's actually opposite. And as this progressed, the perception of men was that they were mainly self-interested and ego-driven and acquisitive, meaning the idea of acquiring or to be greedy, right? Gecko, greed is good. It's the idea. That's how men are. Such character traits were not only necessary for survival, but in time were thought to be part of the very fabric of masculinity. And the foundation of colonial America, where organic communities were the emphasis rather than the individual, was then reversed. The common good was replaced with the individual good. Thus, when you engaged in business, the goal was not to come to a mutually beneficial agreement, but to gain the advantage, to get the most one could from the deal, to win the negotiation, to beat everyone else for the position. A zero-sum game mentality. A system developed where rapaciousness, not reciprocity, was the ultimate driver. And that system has had an influence upon us, right? Where we say things like one man's loss is another man's gain, right? And so often the business is not governed by the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In business, we set that aside, right? Because this is business. Now, you still find a kind of classical republicanism, or whatever phraseology you want to describe it, in ethnic communities in larger cities, where they do business with each other for the common good. And they are very successful and tend to weather financial storms well. And they do it because they're utterly dependent upon one another. They're not actually able to step into the full industrial economy. And as soon as they're able, maybe in a generation, it will disappear. But they act in a way, because they're dependent upon one another, where it's not a zero-sum game. And this shift to the dog-eat-dog model in time changed the cultural perception, not just of men, but of the family. As Piercy writes, the family became a special protected place, the repository of tender, pure, and generous feelings embodied in the mother, and a bulwark and bastion against the raw, competitive, aggressive, and selfish world of commerce embodied by the father. She continues, this was a dramatic reversal. In colonial days, husbands and fathers had been admonished to be the moral and spiritual leaders of the household, but now men were being told that they were naturally crude and brutish, and that they needed to learn virtue from their wives. And the majority of men believed this. Now, this is shocking, but Ulysses S. Grant, during the Civil War, wrote this to his wife, Julia. If I feel tempted to do anything I now think is not right, I ask myself, if Julia saw me, would I do so? And thus it is, absent or present, I am no more or less governed by what I think is your will. Now, it wasn't just the Yankees who had bought into this myth of the innate moral superiority of women. The Confederate General William Pender wrote this to his wife, I have almost come to feel that you are part of my religion. Whenever I find my mind wandering upon bad and sinful thoughts, I try to think of my good and pure wife, and they leave me at once. You are truly my good angel. Now, these are not men that we typically think is weak, because they were great guardians, but they had given their moral strength to women, abdicating their responsibility as nurturers. And thus a double standard had formed. Women by nature were thought to have superior moral sensibility, and men were brutes by nature who needed moral training in order to be civilized, right? Think of the great Western Clint Eastwood, Unforgiven, right? He's a horrible, murdering, thieving man, and he marries this woman, and she changes him. Then his wife dies, and he goes right back to murdering. So men have to be civilized, right? And thus women were better suited to the moral and spiritual instruction of their children. And this led in turn to the feminizing, and in the absence of popular male influence, really the sentimentalizing of the schools and churches. Right? The reason why wokeness has just exploded, the reason why it came into our universities and trickled down to the rest of education, is because of a lack of male guardianship. It's because women primarily, it starts in the social sciences and even in the legal field, but in feminist studies, but because women were in roles of authority and they let it come in. And this has not only perpetuated, this errant view of masculinity, but it has weakened generations of male children. It's producing beta male men who shun masculine virtues. And the eventual creation of this bumbling, goofy, clueless, irrelevant dad that's so often depicted in the cultural narrative. He's essentially a sperm donor who's there for comic relief. That's it. Again, we're going to talk about toxic mothering in modern women next time, so I'm sure no one will come. But But all of this has created an entire society that lacks the strength that would come through male nurturing. The hard winds needed to strengthen young saplings, boys and girls, so that they won't collapse at the first coming of the storm. And thus our greatest need at the moment is for men to return to their role as nurturers and guardians. Now, not foolish men, right? Foolish men who will just lord it over everyone. And there's a long line of men, apparently foolish men, who are eager to flex their muscles and demonstrate how they can lead. What we need are wise and holy men. Which men who are now foolish, they are grown, can become wise, but primarily this must focus upon the children. We must raise up wise men. There is a dearth of wisdom among men in our time. Let me end with two bits of evidence for this theory I put forward. The first is anecdotal. In all of my experience in Christian education, the students who are in the greatest danger of being lured into the woke cult, especially in terms of transgenderism, are the ones whose fathers are the least involved in their spiritual development. The ones where the wives are hiding these threats from their husbands, or the husbands are just kowtowing to their wives. Everyone, I guess, believing the lie that men have nothing of value to contribute to this crisis. By the way, the ending of wokeness comes from men standing up and saying, enough of this nonsense. We're done. No more. That's it. In addition to this, Piercy references a massive study which just came out, a 35-year longitudinal investigation, and how faith is passed down generationally. And the most striking finding was that 68% of children who have a strong relationship with their father will carry on his level of religious participation. 68%. According to one of the authors of the study, quote, for religious transmission, having a close bond with one's father matters more than a close relationship with one's mother. Now, the question of how men can reassert themselves into the role of nurturer, given our present political and economic system, is a challenging one. But one thing I can say for sure is that there aren't any easy solutions. It's not as simple as going back to the colonial period, which, by the way, had its own problems. Right? We can't just set up an Amish community, engage in cosplay and pretend like we're all dependent upon one another and we can leave at any moment. That's not going to work. We can't pretend. It's interesting, C.R. Wiley, in the passages that we read, hopefully you all discuss, references a great quote from Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. We can't go back. We can't just recreate. What we have to do is engage in what's called resourcement, to resource the things in the past that we've let go, to pick them up again and bring them forward into the present and figure out how to apply them. That's difficult work. It takes a lot of wisdom. It will take time. But that's what must be done. Regardless of which path we take, men must return to the head of their households, actively nurturing their wives and children, shoring up the institution of the family, or the reformation of our society will never come. Listen to me, don't spend any time. If your family's in shambles, if your household's in shambles, if you are not actively nurturing and acting as a guardian over your family, spend no time at all when it comes to societal reform. None, zilch. Fix your family first. Because anything you do on the outside is going to be undermined by it. Right? Cultural renewal comes from the individual households, and the individual households coming together and working. What we need desperately right now are biblical households. That's what we need. That's what you should build. That's what this book is going to help teach you how to do. We also have to be a society where we return to seeking the common good as the ultimate end, and not the individual good. We have to reclaim the virtue of pietas, because that is the path to flourishing. To live a life of self-denial, not self-assertion. It's a tall order, but required nonetheless.